And we are live with another episode of the Unpublic with Citizen Stewart. This morning, I have with me Parker Baxter, who is a JD, which is an attorney, if you didn't know, Juris Doctor, and MPA, a scholar in residence and director of the Center of Education Policy Analysis at the University of Colorado, Denver School of Public Affairs. The reason that we have Parker on today is because in a previous show, I had covered I'll say it's a myth. It had covered the idea that American public schools are based upon a factory model, but from a unique perspective. The perspective was, I had a guest, historian Jenn Binnis, who was on the show to argue that idea that schools are built on a factory model is a myth, and that it was an ahistorical myth that was invented to destroy public schools, to get people to look beyond traditional public schools for education. She added a feminist lens to it to say that also it was a way of demeaning the women in the workforce of the public education system by attributing their great work and the things that they did on a daily basis to to a few powerful men. Like Horace Mann and the folks that filled out the General Education Board, which was the board that did many of the early philanthropic efforts to improve schools, to create secondary schools, and to get more American kids educated. She saw them as marginal figures, wondered why would we concentrate so much on folks like that, like the father of public school and public education, and some of the earliest investors in American and influencers in American public education. And I thought that was a really, to say the least, I thought it was a bizarre argument, but I wasn't alone. So Parker actually had seen some of that show and wanted to come on and help me see things from a different perspective, possibly from the perspective that I had before I started that show, but with some facts from history and the way that it applies to current public education policy. So, Parker, good morning. Thank you for joining.
Good morning. Thanks for having me, Chris. Good to be here.
Well, listen, you saw that show that we did, and I want to start at the top. What is wrong with the idea that this is not a real thing? The factory school model is not a real thing. It's a myth that was invented.
Yeah, so I have spent past few years digging into this history of the formation of school districts as part of my work on this new education policy program we've launched at the School of Public Affairs at CU Denver. And, I think, first of all, it's important to be to differentiate between claims that are made about classrooms and schools and teachers looking like factories and acting like factory workers, and then what I think is really a more substantive claim, which is the actual history of the formation of school districts and the really clear line between the industrial management revolution that was happening at the time and the need to create school systems on a mass scale in a very rapid span of time, and that the model that was used to create mass education was explicitly modeled after the industrial era manufacturing model, and strict forms of supervision and control, seniority as a major factor in labor management practices, and all sorts of other aspects of the overall system. And I think that, I hope, helps people see that, I myself certainly am not trying to make a claim about what's happening inside classrooms or inside schools. I think really the issue is more about the way that systems are structured outside of schools, and then and frankly the way that that structure then has lots of implications.
Well, to be explicit about those structures, so one of the arguments that I had that started the last show was that there were people from the United States and from Canada that went to see the Prussian education model. The history of that education model was that, and this is the history as told by people like John Taylor Gatto. The history of that model was they had suffered bruising losses with their military. They wanted to devise a system that would get their soldiers in line because they were making too many random decisions on the battlefield. That was what they attributed the loss to. And because of that, they developed a system for training that that persists today. Many people went over to and saw that system that was based upon bells and discrete classes and everybody age bands and everybody moving along at the same time, whatever. They brought that to the United States in the form of original legislation with Horace Mann and others. So that's a historical story. That's a story to be told. I'm not saying whether it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that's how I set up the previous show.
Yeah, and I think that's a good example too of the way that which this conversation, this debate can often go in different directions. And so I will say, frankly, I think the focus on Prussia is a little bit of a distraction because, in my view, it's one aspect of a much longer and more complex history than that, and it also is an issue that speaks to pedagogical issues, right? It is really more about the relationship to Prussia is more about the graded school, the scheduling, the sort of machinations inside the school, what David Tyack called the grammar of schooling. But then I think that if we get too focused on that, we forget the ways in which the actual systems themselves in the United States between 1840 and 1920 were designed structurally, again, after large industrial era manufacturing firms. And that's a different dynamic than the Prussia point, and is in some ways one I'm more comfortable making, because I think the Prussia point starts to get into sort of making claims about the content of American education writ large, and I think that's very difficult to do. I mean, there are lots of ways we could talk about how education was specifically intended to Americanize the population, right? That's another element of that the Prussia thing doesn't really speak to as much, but I just kind of know this is where we.
Maybe it doesn't. Maybe it does in one way. So, so let's put it to sleep. We'll put the Prussia thing to sleep. But we'll say this: prior to that influence, that was made that was the precursor to mass education. And that's really Gatto's point, is that it was a setup for mass education. Yeah. And to have mass education, you have to have systems that do mass education, which are very depersonalized, large factory type systems. Prior to that point, education was a very entrepreneurial, case by case, town by town, locally delivered, family delivered. It was a different atmosphere in terms of what could happen for education. After bringing that model into the schooling system, there was a premise for what you say comes next, which is Tyack's like one best system, the administrative state of education, right? Like the big daddies. Are there explicit connections between what I was calling captains of industry, or people like Henry Ford or others, that give us the proof that there's some fingerprints on the education system from the factory people, from the people that saw the world in terms of factories?
Sure. So first of all, I think this point about the sort of shift into the modern mass system, I think, is also just important to note that there's overlapping periods here in American history, because you have to remember that the development of America, beginning on the East Coast and then westward expansion, allowed school systems that started west to model themselves on the systems that had already been built. And the other dynamic you have at this time is mass urbanization and immigration, which really starts to create an sort of unique dynamic for education in cities. And then at the same time, you still have the one-room schoolhouse everywhere else. And so, a statistic I often share with my students is that in 1910, there were 200,000 school districts. In 1910, there were 200,000 school districts, because each school district was a school. And by 1960, today there are less than 16,000 school districts. And if you think about the fact that the population did the reverse, it's hard to explain unless you recognize that all of those thousands, tens of thousands of one-room school districts were consolidated into unified systems between approximately 1920 and 1970. And so, the development of these systems happened sort of in parallel. And so that's another reason why people often will say, oh, well, you're only talking about the development of the urban system and you're leaving out, so that's one point. And then I think,
on that one point, just to say on that one point, that was done for a business concept, which was called economy of scale, right?
Right. Like we had Frederick Taylor here in the scientific management. It's impossible to separate the system, the development of these mass systems, from the development of American industry and all of the ideology around efficiency and control, authority, accountability. Those are all wrapped up in the system. And so, one of the things I'm fascinated by, if anyone really does want to get into this and is actually still wondering whether there is evidence that there was business influence or influence of industrial era management practices on schooling, in the late 1800s, as school systems were developing, the sort of leaders of the field, the sort of early scholars of education, and the first deans of the schools of education launched this national effort where they sent out people to survey school districts all over the country. And so there is an amazing archive that has now been digitized, fortunately, of all of these surveys of city school systems. And what's fascinating in them is that they are doing these surveys from the perspective of there is a one best way to operate a large modern school system, and we need to make sure that the whole country learns it. And so I just want to, if you bear with me, I'm going to read you just a quick excerpt from one. But so this section in the report is called A Right Plan of Organization. The above criticisms and proposals have been made in light of the best practice in city schools throughout the country, and they are supported quite as fully by the fundamental principles of administrative organization wherever they apply, in business, in commerce, or education. Big business has made its way by means of a highly centralized management, And while the management of a school system may not be a case parallel in every detail with an industrial institution, wherever the principle of centralized control has been carefully worked out in education, it has brought results.
Mm.
So that's from a survey of Boise, Idaho's school system in 1913. And it's remarkable that you can pull up the org chart from there, from the ideal org chart. And at the top, you have the Board of Education, and then underneath you have the superintendent, and underneath you have the layers of the bureaucratic organization. And, again, I recognize that for people who live every day of their lives in classrooms and working, in scarcity and feeling disrespected, and that hearing this can really make it feel like people are saying that our current systems are like factories, and I really don't think that that's the point of this. But I think we're making a major mistake if we don't understand the ways in which the structure of the system does play out in lots of different ways.
I hear you kind of shying away from the point about this factory model being a criticism or a critique of what happens at the school and the classroom level. But what I can't get away from is how compartmentalized different subjects are, ages and grade bands, the systems of assessment, the alignment of how students become a number when they walk in a building. And these are artifacts of the consolidation you talked about. So in the late 1950s or 60s, you had twice the number of schools that we have and half the number of students, which meant you had a lot more decentralization than centralization. So the mega mass-produced high school. So I look at some, Columbine style high schools and think they look like Tyson plants to me. What is being produced in there? What is being processed? What's the product? What's the input? What's the output? And you have thousands of kids going through a building and having to, in a very kind of systemic way, having to be ordered and routed and tracked and assessed and weighed and eventually graduated from the plant. And I can't get away from that being a ground level experience of what it looks like when I say factory model. Like, it was never meant to have, it was never smart to have 1,600 kid high schools, 2,000 kid high schools. And we have evidence that says that that's not good. As a matter of fact, we have evidence that says there's a diseconomy of scale at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a whole bunch of things going on here. So first of all, I mean, I think what you hear me trying to grapple with or acknowledge is that there is a difference between saying that the system is structured in certain ways and the claim that the people inside the system are complicit and fully on board with that, right? And I actually think that the history of education in the United States is in many ways a history of rebellion against this systemic structure, even among people who have a hard time admitting publicly that structure exists, right? And we're living in this sort of we're trapped in this thing where public education, and the people inside of it have felt under attack from the very beginning. And it is true that there has been this long, multiple century push to get people to even buy into the idea. And so I do think then to be told that you're just a factory worker, is part of the challenge of how we talk about this. And that is one reason why I really want to just recognize that, even though it is true that the content of schooling also has elements that look like industrial era ideology, but we also know that inside schools there have been educators forever who have been focused on creativity and on unleashing the individual, abilities of each of their students. And even in the literature, going back to the 19th century, you can see this tension playing out, where the system builders would say the whole goal of this machine is to create individual empowerment. And so even as they're trying to articulate the rationale for the machine, they know that actually education itself is not like a widget coming off of an assembly line.
So when I read some of the literature, what I see going way back is the idea that there's certain types of citizens that they're attempting to produce. So I seen for instance, the General Education Board, which was, Rockefeller and others who put millions, I mean, in today's money, it would be billions of dollars into the formation of public education. There was the idea that we're not trying to build artists and artisans and Socrates thinkers and deep thinkers, blah, blah, blah. It was right in the literature that they were not trying to produce thinking people. They were trying to produce useful people who had use in society. Not to say that being useful is a bad thing, because at that time there were a lot of people that didn't have the skill to take advantage of the emerging kind of economy and the things that were coming down the pipe in terms of jobs. But it was very clear that they were thinking that there would be a different types, just like Jefferson, that there would be a different type of education for the elite and for the people who owned land and whatever versus everybody else. So there is that idea from the very beginning that they're going to produce a certain type of obedient worker, and then later it became Americanization. It was going to wash all these unwashed people from all around the world and turn out sheep, basically. So I can't get past that particular thing. But when you say the thing about the educators in the building who would blanch at the idea that they're part of a system, first of all, no worker in any system who stays in that system over a period of time, who considers themselves time-bound and loyal to that system, is ever going to say, I'm doing a bad thing, right? So you've had, psychological experiments where you can get people to turn a knob that hurts people. It's not really hurting them, but just because they're told to do it and they're within a system, they do it, right? Or peer pressure. The clearest evidence that teachers and educators are complicit, to me, is in their push for how you pay teachers. Steps and lanes, not merit, not talent, not ability, but time on the job, seat time, stand time, seniority, steps, lanes, and everybody gets paid the same depending on where they are, directly lifted from the factory, right? As a pay scheme. Mm-hmm. And if you go and try and interrupt that, guess what happens? Every educator with a t-shirt that is either red or yellow t-shirt shows up and says, no. That is foundational to our work here. That's not, So what about that?
Yeah. So no, I think just as there is a real danger in being sort of flippant about our characterizations of entire systems or entire professions, I also think it is absolutely critical to interrogate this resistance to grappling with the system as it is. And so you just gave several examples, which a fixed salary schedule that does not differentiate among employees except based on seniority is a classic example of an industrial labor management practice, and is I think it's a fascinating thing, because it I guess I wonder whether some of the resistance in talking about these structural issues is that it makes it necessary to defend existing practices on their own terms. And that can be difficult. And so the example of the set salary schedule is one where it is really remarkable that there are 16,000 school districts in the country, and almost every single one of them uses a fixed salary schedule with steps and lanes, and it the challenge there is that even questioning that as an intelligent system for compensating teachers, the best system for fair system, any conversation of that seems to take place at this maximalist level of either we protect teachers or we don't. And that, I think, it is really unfortunate because in all other areas of American life, we recognize the ways in which the structural aspects of institutions operate, often unintentionally even, to perpetuate inequality and injustice. And the idea that these existing systems are not doing that, to me, is really highly unlikely. And so I do think that it is problematic that in our effort to try to ensure accuracy and the full complexity of experience, that we don't actually grapple with these basic fundamental aspects of the system. Student assignment is another great example of an industrial era practice. If you have tens of thousands of students and you need to get them into school, then assignment is without a doubt the most predictable, efficient way to do so. It
and
allows
regressive.
the system to flex, right? And
Yeah.
so another great example, I mean, if we don't think that there are challenges with assignment, that again, I think we're not asking ourselves to examine reality.
Yeah, and this is where I differ a little bit from your basic point, which I think it's instructive, the message that you bring about this, that there are public policies, schools and school districts and classrooms are creatures of law and public policy. So if you want to change them, public policy is dictating what they do right now. So I agree with you there. I also agree with you not to be, kind of flamboyant with arguments like the John Taylor Gatto arguments, because, those of us who subscribe to that area of thought oftentimes can be seen as going off on wild tangents. Like those are intellectual tangents. I don't think so, but I know that that's the rap that the Gatto folks have. But I continue to see the fingerprints of the factory thing that is to the detriment of students and to individual free thinking people, to put them into systems where everything is so designed, in my mind, to create a certain type of American. And to me, you're saying that that's part of the cultural or the content part, but I also believe it's part of the policy part. The example I just gave you about teachers and how they're paid is one, but if you look at their contracts, there's a lot of other stuff going on too, besides their steps and lanes, right? So when teachers get mad at the system and they say, we're going to work to rule, meaning we're just going to work to what the contract says or whatever, or do the minimum, which is a thing. It's a labor practice that they use to get their way. You find out that they have contracted the learning day within an inch of its life, man. Right? Like, thou shalt do only this for this amount of time and no more. And thou shalt not do this or whatever. And at some point you start to figure out that agreement between labor and management is very much it's not geared at producing the best learning environments or great learners, great students. That's just my take on it.
Well, and I look, and I have a couple of things real quick. Do we have a couple of minutes?
Yeah. No, we're good.
Just on this point, because two different things. So one, I think you're referencing this sort of purposes of public education in America point, which I think I completely agree. There's definitely a lot of evidence that a lot of people in the building of our education system believed that they were Americanizing children, that they were converting them into useful citizens, etc. But there's also always been people following people like Rousseau who have said that education, the purpose of education, is actually human enlightenment, and is the individual has a right to education independent of its benefits to society. And so I think I just want to note that that also is an area where we can sometimes fall into the trap of trying to find one sort of purpose to latch onto. And I think it's important to recognize that there are multiple purposes, because in fact, often what happens in these debates is we zero in on one purpose because it seems to fit the policy that we want to be pushing. So, and then I think the other thing I find fascinating about the sort of ongoing industrial, I use an example in my class of a school that's in a mining town, and the mine closes, and the school district needs to decide what to do with that school, and there are 10 teachers in there, and what does the district do? And you know, the fact is there is a very clear answer all across the country for this question, and it is it's not clear that that answer it is always promotes equity, and you know, especially for vulnerable students across the system. And so teacher assignment policies are a classic example of where I feel like efforts to not talk about the elements of our system that do resemble industrial era labor management practices are efforts to avoid discussions of exactly this kind of situation where the existing system operates and people want to not actually look underneath at the consequences of that system. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm definitely of the view that the more that we can be honest about these structures, the better. You know, and
Well, on this
and
point,
there are kids getting hurt by our unwillingness to grapple with them.
let me ask you this question on this point. When you talk about Rousseau and the Rousseauist thinking and ideology, the perfectibility of man and the ability of us to do what I want the school system to do, was help each person reach their kind of potential, their individual potential, and it doesn't have to be a benefit to society. What are the strongest kind of structural evidence of that thinking in the system? Where is the Rousseauist thinking in the administration, the structure, and the funding of public education?
So I don't know if this is going to answer your question directly, but I guess I think I'm trying to get an example. So one of the examples I use to differentiate the British system from the American system is the use of tracking and sort of early on in a child's educational career, they will be placed into kind of a track based on their test results. And that you know, there were elements of that throughout American history, but in general, I think our system is much more built on this idea that all kids can actually reach the pinnacle, and we're not going to try to, you know, say you're going to be a mechanic when you're older and you're going to be a doctor. We do that all in all sorts of ways, but I mean, I'm not trying to pretend, right? But I think it is an important distinction that really as much as we have never lived up to this ideal, I do think the ideal in America is more Rousseauian than it is Taylorist, right? That it is actually, we actually have an ideal of trying to empower all people to you know, pursue their dreams, and I don't think it's necessarily it is definitely a cultural underpinning that we have to prepare workers, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that that is actually the dominant view of education. Maybe you have a different one.
Well, I mean, I think it depends on what student population you're talking about for sure. I do think that that tracking has been a device, an American public education system device to sort students into those that are meant in a very Jeffersonian way to lead some to merit and others to occupation, to lead some to college and others to vocation. Right. So,
Yeah, I
sometimes they
guess
can.
right. I mean, I think there's a real difference between the government deciding that and on the front end and people pursuing that themselves, right?
In a way, except for if it's your government employees who are doing the tracking without you knowing it against your will, and that's the realistic. You like it, like there's a difference between ideal and realism. There's a difference between what should be and what is. So the school system, the marketing for the public education system is full of very Rousseauist kind of language. The
Mm-hmm.
marketing of the system
Mm-hmm.
is full of it. The realistic output of the system, depending on who you are and what your demography is totally different than the marketing, right? Like
Yeah.
some kids are going to Pleasantville 1952 schools, and other people are going to schools that are a straight up kind of straight ticket to either welfare or prison, right? Like when we talked about failure factories 10 or 15 years or so ago, there was a statistical reality that was too stark to ignore.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And I mean, we still see this in a lack of AP class access, right? IB courses. I mean, we still see even this incessant talk about, career and technical education, but only for some kids, apparently.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I think I'll just throw out to you. I think the reason why I zero in on this purposes question and why I find it interesting is because I want to point you to a way in which I think it does play into this conversation in terms of alternative possibilities, which is that, one argument used against school choice, is that it is somehow inconsistent with the purpose of education being citizenship and communal sort of cross socioeconomic interaction, right? That is arguably one of the purposes of the public education system. And we sometimes talk about the need for the system, for a single unified system, that one of the purposes of having that thing and one of the reasons why we're told we can't have alternative delivery systems is because in the ideal or the mythology around this is that the large system forces all of these different types of people to come together from all across the city into these museums of virtue, as they were called back then. And the challenge is that we've never actually had museums of virtue for low income Black and brown children in America, but that is certainly a part of this conversation. And so the reason why I find it important to remind people that there are multiple purposes of education is that one of them, for example, is that my right to an education does not depend on the benefits to anyone else, and that I don't
Mm-hmm.
right
Mm-hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
I'm seeking empowerment and liberation for myself and for my loved ones, and it actually is not relevant whether it benefits you or not. And I think that's part of what's going on here, right? Is that if we only define education as in terms of its value to other people, that sort of raises.
Well, now
That,
you're
that, that
raising.
sounds a lot like an industrial era mentality to me.
Yeah, you're raising like a point to me that's super interesting and very provocative, though. And I don't know that it plays it. I don't know that it supports your argument because
I know well, my
think about
argument is
this.
about complexity, though. That's the point. I don't think there's a very clear line here, but go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, but there's got to be very clear lines on things like human rights, right? Like the UN has described a right to every individual, not in the United States, in the world, to a fitting education, and the right of the parent to determine that. Article 26, Section 3, right, gives you that right. That's not an American right. That's a global, like, human right. But let me back up and just say, because you were saying something, I was getting kind of like really I love these great ideas, that help me understand more.
Empowerment and liberation.
But what do you say, Parker, like really about a system that produces people that believe the marketing, the Rousseauist stuff that supports the idea of one best system, a single system, centralizes the system rather than the person, right? The system. If you leave our schools, what will it do to the system? Not what will it do to you, right? What if you need a day school, a Quaker day school education versus a Methodist education versus a Montessori education versus something outside of the one best system? The question from American sheep to you will instantly be, but what will that do to our system? Not the Rousseauist, what will that do to you as your development as a person? What do you think about a system?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah.
Here's one question though. What do you think about a system that doesn't teach you the history of the system itself that you're in enough to know that anti-choice rhetoric was very racist and was very anti-Catholic, anti-pluralism, anti-multiculturalism?
Yeah, I mean, we can. Yeah, so I'll jump in and just say, I mean, I find it remarkable that we seem to we seem to glorify this system, which was built while millions of Americans were enslaved. Right, like the idea that we built this one best system and that there is no other alternative, and that for the vast majority of the development of that system, millions of people were enslaved, millions were being robbed of their land. It's like, yeah, I mean, and that, I think that should, like, the idea that that's not an important factor in the structure of the system. In what other area of our lives would we accept that likelihood? Right? That this system, which was built when millions of people were enslaved, and suddenly today we're supposed to believe that it's actually structurally neutral. I mean, this is the kind of stuff where we talk about I know you and I both have great respect for Derek Bell, and like, this is something I learned from Derek. Like, you don't stare at our current institutions and presume they're neutral when we know they're against a backdrop of blood and sin. So
well, and
that
also,
does not mean that the American education system is not also one of the greatest human achievements ever.
Oh yeah,
right? We have to be able to hold those two contradictory ideas at the same time, both that the system might be structurally inequitable and yet still be this amazing thing.
Well, I'm challenged by that one. Here's why I'm challenged by that one. I don't think those are equal ideas. I don't think that there's anything to balance. I just think you just talk about what is as reality, like what is, so I don't know whether it's one of the greatest ideals, because I think that's actually a little bit beyond the scope of talking about like realism, like what a thing actually is. I do know, like, Ashley Berner tells us that we're an outlier, for instance, when it comes to respecting the pluralism of a population, that the United States is a first world outlier in the way that we administer education. So that to me doesn't feel like exceptionalism.
Yeah, let me just clarify real quickly that part of what I'm saying is that I mainly mean in terms of the human ingenuity of the creation of the system to respond to this need was, that it actually met the needs of the time, even though it was racist and inequitable. Like, Chicago had 4,000 students in 1840 and 1 million by 1910. I mean, like, the system just exploded. And so that's basically what I mean, is that it is remarkable that we have, across such a huge country and millions of people, that we actually do have a functioning public education system, where there's still lots of countries today that don't educate their children at all, is my point.
Is your fear in going too far on the factory discussion and the Taylor Gatto stuff and all of that, that it will imperil education policy now for people that that may not exactly believe that way of thinking, but are still within the realm of, like,
Yes.
common thinking, like we
Yeah.
can find common ground.
Yes, it's also, I also think that we just can't forget that the existing system is currently serving millions of people who need those services, and that
Mhm.
we need to find a way to acknowledge that the system needs to be improved, while at the same time recognizing that shifting to different systems is really fraught, and really challenging, and is likely to be most difficult for the most vulnerable people who are already not well served in these systems. So I think this is also why I think I'm so one of the reasons why I feel like the politics is such a danger to this debate, is that the more we politicize this and act in extremes, it's a factory, it's not a factory, it's a, it's monopoly, it's not a monopoly. Like, the more that we're fighting in those extremes, the less we're paying attention to the way that this transformation is already happening without
Mhm.
us even, meaning for it to. And that if we don't pay attention to that and do it deliberately, we really will just recreate an inequitable system, whatever it looks
so
like.
so when I go really far on that side, like, because I see things in extremes, right?
Yeah.
Like, I see us, I like, for me, captivity is extreme, and being captive to an occupational class of people that have the political class by the neck, and basically make it very hard for people who want to be free people and want to get a free education in the freedom of their own religion or their own, whatever their cultural background is or whatnot. That thing is pretty extreme to me, and it's imperiled by an occupational class of the main system having the political class completely by the neck. And the way that they have them by the neck are by all these pretty stories that we tell each other about the cornerstone of democracy and about the engine of democracy, and the heroic teacher who's working a thankless job that has no kind of, after a while, all of that starts to look like
Yeah.
that's pretty extreme. But are you
No,
afraid
and
that maybe I'm on the QAnon
no,
side of
no,
education
and I
reform?
want to be clear that I think there's a difference between being um, acting with humility and respect for the complexity of people's experience, and the sort of the absolute need to be honest about reality. So yes, like, part of why I talk about this in this way is because I do think it is, to ignore this reality is actually only to perpetuate the injustice. And so I actually think, to your point, like, it's the structures, though, that I think we need to be really thoughtful about transforming over time. And right now, we're still in this mode where if you have 100 people who are being disenfranchised, and you give 5 of them the power to, to pursue empowerment, it's not clear that that will eventually lead to the ability of the others who are being disempowered to pursue the same thing.
Mhm,
And I
mhm.
feel like right now we're in that mode where, yes, of course, people need to be able to pursue, self-determination, but we also need to recognize that the system itself is resisting that, and it's not clear that it's actually changing in response to those efforts to disrupt. And so I worry that we sort of are going to stay stuck in this world where some have been given the access to empower themselves, outside of the traditional paradigm, and then the system continues to operate for everyone else the way it always has.
So what's the positive step forward? I mean, we've talked over two shows now about the factory model, the suggestion that the industrialization of education is not really the way that we want to be or that we want to go. So you, as a person who really focuses on public administration and public policy, what are some of the things that you think would be the positive steps forward, at least in our policy chops? I mean, and you
Yeah.
know, you knowing that we've tried a lot of things in the last, I'd say 10, 15, 20 years, there's been all different kinds of like policy, parent trigger and,
Yeah.
school choice stuff,
Well,
whatever.
so I'll give it, I'll give an example of one policy that I think is an example of how this debate plays out. So, um, you know, uh, Denver Public Schools for a long time has had a unified school choice system, a common school choice system. And it's been fascinating to me to watch this over time, because that system engenders interesting reactions from sort of both poles of the education reform debate. Folks who are concerned about districts, you know, total, what they perceive as a total unwillingness on the part of districts to let go of authority. Some people see the common enrollment system as just a way to control choice. It's actually a way to limit it and keep it within the system. And then on the other extreme, you have people that see a common enrollment system as somehow a way to encourage free market competition and right. And like the fact that both extremes don't like this solution, which is meant to actually provide individual agency within a framework of public purposes. Like if I mean, yeah, so I'm hopeful for solutions like that recognize the need for a system, uh, right? That we need to recognize that we are engaged in a common endeavor. Public education is not an atomistic thing, and yet we also need to be able to allow people to pursue their own empowerment, and recognize that there are children have different needs, etc., right? And the interesting thing is these challenges have been here since the beginning of education in America, and we have just been constantly leaning towards pretending as if they aren't real. And so I guess for me, the future, I hope, is really one in which we start to grapple with the ways in which these existing systems really do, as much as they may serve purposes, they also perpetuate inequalities, and we need to be willing to consider whether there may be alternative ways that we can fulfill the purposes that we're trying to achieve without assuming that the sort of inequality that flows from trying to treat everyone the same is necessary.
Mm-hmm. I think that Dr. Fuller, what he says about these schools and school systems always sticks in my mind when he says, the way that we do our education is a system. And last time I checked, systems weren't created by God, which means they can be changed.
I mean, the idea that this group of white men in the 1800s in the United States, figured out the only way to deliver public education in a free society is just highly unlikely. And so again, I just feel like if we're honest with ourselves, and if we want to find solutions, we need to be willing to grapple with the ways in which we're still living with our history, and that it's still present.
Well, I appreciate you giving us this much of your time today. My final word on all of this is to basically just say, I know that we have immense human potential in our school systems that isn't being realized. And there is, that's a waste. And, for those of us that are people of faith, like that's beyond a waste of like you're wasting food. That's like you're wasting the value of humans, human value. And anything that we can do to, anything we can do to restructure the systems that our young people go through, the systems that help prepare our young people for meaningful lives, is worth doing. So I think that anybody, whether you work in the system or outside of the system, we have to consider this not about work and not about your job or about legislation or even policy. It's really a matter of, human rights, and are we doing the most with what we have for our young people. We're a super rich country. Like, we're super rich in so many ways that we should be rich in opportunity for our young people to fully find themselves and find their place in the world. We can't do that if we're just like stuck on old stories. Kind of as the kids would have said, 20 years ago, stuck on stupid. That's my Gen X kind of assessment of this, is that we really are stuck in some ways on all the wrong thinking. We're not going the right way. So Parker, thank you again.
Yep, thank you. Thank you very much, Chris, for having me.
I appreciate it. People, you can find Parker. He is Parker Baxter, JD, MPA. He's a scholar in residence and director of the Center of Education Policy Analysis at the University of Colorado. The University of Colorado, Denver School of Public Affairs. This has been.
Check out edsystemsleadership.org. We're hosting our Summer Institute in Education Systems Leadership this summer, July 19th, and we'd love to have folks join us to talk about exactly this stuff. And I hope, Chris, you will be another guest speaker.
I'd love to do it. And anybody who's listening to this just offhand and you want to find out more information about that, ping me. I'll get you the information. I'll get you the link to it so that you can see it. As always, Great. Thank you all for giving us an hour of your time each morning. We appreciate you. Have a great day. Keep fighting for the kids.